This podcast is for informational purposes only. It is not intended to provide medical advice. It exists only to entertain.
Poor historians, poor historians. We look at cases through our history. It's just Max in there and Mac and me. You gotta listen, you don't have to read. Poor historians, poor historians, poor historians.
Hey there, Poor Historians listener. This is Dr. Max from the show. Welcome to the episode that officially begins our weekly releases. As I've mentioned elsewhere, if you're a fan of how we normally do things around here, don't worry at all. The normal educational ridiculousness will continue every other week. But today, we are going to be kicking off our other show type, and this will be the first in a series of interviews bringing you behind the scenes of some of the most prominent medical history museums in the world. So with that, today we'll check out the National Museum of Civil War Medicine with their historian, Kyle Dalton. We'll find out what sorts of amputation kits a museum might prefer you show up with, and we'll find out how Civil War medicine may have killed President Garfield. And we'll talk about the real deal with amputations during this war. Why were there so many compared to other conflicts at the time? And what does the U.S. Civil War have to do with Japan? We're going to go through a bunch of subjects. And oh, I almost forgot. We'll also find out what the postmaster has to do with safe sex practices while we discuss the strangest item this museum holds in its collection, in a tasteful manner, of course. And with that, let's get to the interview. And stay tuned for outtakes, as per usual at the end of the show. We are here today with Kyle Dalton. He is a historian who you may recognize from a previous show that we did, talking about the U.S. Civil War, the Ambulance Corps, and related medical history. He is coming back from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, where he brings with him 20 years of experience as a public historian and educator. In addition to his museum duties, he also spends his free time, much like we all do, writing a bunch of stuff about medical history on his blog, British Tars, the exploration of the lives of common sailors from 1740 to 1790. It's really great to have you back, Kyle.
Glad to be here.
We are doing the inaugural museum interview episode where we're trying to get to know folks in the museum circuit, museums having to do with medical history and all related affairs. So we wanted to have Kyle on so that we can talk about not only the museum he works with, but also talk about the collection, some of the interesting items, and some of the interesting, obvious medical history that goes along with that. And so to that effect, I wanted to start by just kind of asking you a little bit, Kyle, about overview of the museum.
We are the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We have 3 locations. We're one museum in 3, kind of a holy trinity, if you will. There's the main location in Frederick, Maryland. That's our sort of headquarters. That's where I'm broadcasting from today. It's got 8,000 square feet of exhibit space. It covers the length of the war, 1861 to 1865. And talks about all the different medical innovations and challenges that existed in that period. We're talking anesthesia, ambulances, blood control, surgical amputation. If it has to do with medical history, we talk about it here. We then have 2 other sites, 2 satellite locations that are a little bit more focused. There's the Pry House Field Hospital Museum on Antietam National Battlefield. It was an actual field hospital used during the Civil War. So there we focus on the family that was present when the hospital was running. We talk about some of the patients that were treated there. We talk about on-the-ground medical care after the bloodiest day in American history. And our 3rd location is in Washington, D.C. That's the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office. We talk about the life of Clara Barton, the famous nurse and humanitarian, and especially on her immediate post-war efforts. She lived there throughout the war. It was a boarding house originally. It was an apartment building, and she ran her humanitarian efforts out of there. So she would collect supplies for the hospitals and then distribute them from Washington, D.C. But after the war, she converted it into an office to find missing soldiers and successfully identified 20,000 missing people. It's the beginning of the POW MIA movement, basically.
Oh, no kidding. Is that just from the Civil War, or?
Yeah, just from the Civil War. Yeah, she shut down the office after a few years. They did as much as they could, and then she traveled the world. She served in the Franco-Prussian War. She went to Armenia and tried to help the people there. She was doing all kinds of stuff. So this was only a few years that she was operating, but it set the basis for finding missing persons after a war has concluded.
Interesting. So besides, enduring the world uniforms in the midsummer heat, 100-degree plus heat for your social media fans, which is one of my favorite videos that you did, everybody should go check out not only all the other stuff that you're doing.
Was that the one with the outtakes?
Yeah, it was the outtakes.
Yeah,
that was
good.
Yeah. I had to bleep out a few words in that one.
That makes it so much better.
Besides that, how long have you been working for the museum?
I've been here for about 3 years now, going on 4. I am the membership and development coordinator. So I do public history, obviously. I'm here today doing it. But I'm also in charge of all the number crunching. I know this is a visual medium and our audience can't see it, but I'm sure you guys can see my stalker wall of graphs and statistics.
Oh my God.
That's my main job, is tracking the market, seeing who can we get through the door? What are they looking for? How can we meet what our audience expects? That's my main job here.
The only thing I don't get about it is there's a lot of yarn and push pins over there. Are you?
There's
working on
Pepe de Silva is written over it.
Continuing Clara Barton's work. Gotta find it.
I really can't complete my job until my boss asks me to turn in my badge and my gun, but we're getting there.
Exactly.
That's fair enough. Is that a musket?
It's a revolver, but close. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. And how did you get interested in medical history? How did you land in the sphere, so to speak?
I've always been into history ever since I was a kid. I was just kind of surrounded by it. I grew up in this tiny little gold mining town, former gold mining town up in the California mountains. And I was just always around history. Medical history kind of came into the picture in my teenage years. It was the 1990s. It was the height of the Civil War in popular culture. Gettysburg was big.
I remember that movie.
Glory.
1989 Glory. Yeah, got the Oscar for Denzel Washington. There was some solid media out there. And being a teenager in the 90s, the thing you did if you were interested was you became a reenactor. But of course, I was too young to use a gun. So they said, oh, you would just do medical stuff. Sure, whatever. Here's a uniform, which is, not really accurate. But as a kid, that's what got me into it. So that kind of started me on this push. And then in college, my thesis was on the ambulance corps. And that kind of set me on the professional path that I'm on now of medical history.
I thought, so you wrote that thesis for our show?
It was prefiguring. I was assuming that someday there would be a podcast featuring 3 professionals in emergency medicine that would ask me specifically to talk about it. So I foresaw your coming.
You are the prince who is promised.
I appreciate all that hard work well in advance of our existence. How did the museum get its start? I think you mentioned a little bit about Pry House, but how about the main museum? Is there a foundational story there?
Yeah, our museum was kind of the idea of Dr. Gordon Dahman. He's a dentist, or was a dentist. He's retired now. And he began collecting medical artifacts in the 1970s. This is on the tail end of the centennial of the Civil War. The 1960s was another era in which there was this kind of high tide of interest in the Civil War. And in the 1970s, he started collecting medical artifacts. His collection eventually forms the backbone of our museum. In 1990, they incorporate the museum, and it's opened here at this location in 1996. It's expanded in 2000, and we are actually just now on the verge of doing a further renovation. We're starting a strategic plan, and we'll soon be raising money for that. So if you enjoy this episode and you feel like giving money to something other than poor historians, check out our website, civilwarmed.org.
Wait, do people give us money, Max?
Yeah, there's a few T-shirt sales out there. So yeah, we
are.
Give
us money, Max?
What I'm hearing is that we are equally important causes. So Kyle, on question for you, I saw on the website that there's about 5,000 artifacts in the collection. Is that still relatively accurate?
Yeah, we haven't dramatically expanded our collections recently, largely because we don't have that much space. We have to process the things we've got.
Fair enough. Do you? Let's dive into a few of the favorites. But where do you guys get these artifacts? Are you going to fortunate estate sales or?
A lot of it is unsolicited donations. I mentioned earlier that Dr. Dahman's collection is kind of the backbone. That's sort of the core. And then we've built on top of that. But most of it is people will come to us. They'll say, hey, I've got this thing. I think it's medical. I think it's Civil War. Are you guys interested? And oftentimes it is neither medical nor Civil War.
Sure.
But
what's an example of that? We need an example of
that. We get a lot of like medals from the Reconstruction era of like various fraternal organizations that doesn't really tie into anything we have to do. And we have to politely decline. I mean, this isn't usually, it's not people trying to stick it to us. It's just they don't know what they have and they want us to help. But sometimes somebody will bring in something and it'll be like, oh, that's really cool. That's a journal that comes from a Civil War surgeon or something. Like this is a one-of-a-kind item. And then, we'll accept that. And that'll go into the permanent collection. But we're not actively searching out unless there's like an exhibit that we're designing. And we're like, oh, we really need a certain kind of stethoscope. Then we'll do a search. We'll see if we can find something. But it's not very common. We don't do that very often. We don't have a ton of space in our collection. So we're trying to process the things we've got.
That's understandable. Is there like a strangest object that somebody showed up to you with?
I'm actually not sure how it was acquired. And I think you've seen this. It's a popular video on our TikTok.
I think I know where it's going.
But yeah, I think you do. We have a Civil War era condom in our collection.
Excellent.
Used or in the package?
It's unused. It was a demonstration piece that would be sent to postmasters. Postmasters were being targeted to sell these by a I don't think you'd call him a pharmacist, a capitalist of some kind, some guy who sells condoms, Isaac DeYoung. He would send these examples out to postmasters and say, hey, if somebody comes to you and wants to buy one, you show them this. This is the real deal. And then he would send them out in packets of 12, I think. And they were sold wholesale to the postmaster who would resell them to whatever community he was in.
After he poked holes in them?
Possibly. I guess it depends on how big he wants his population to get.
Yeah.
And that's got to be a weird interaction with your mailman, cookies at Christmas time or whatnot, and solicitation of condoms.
Right. The mailman had to offer them. It's not like they'd be asking for them.
What was it? The mailman
here's your mail, and then would you guys like
you need something on the side?
They're sometimes called French caps. Or yarners. Yarners are the ribbed variety. They were tied at the base and they were reusable. You were supposed to wash them between uses. The one that we have in our collection is sheepskin. There's a couple of others of this type that survive in other museum collections. One was sold at auction a couple of months ago.
How much?
There's also...
That's what I needed to know.
I think it went... I'm trying to remember now. I think it went for about $2,000.
Oh my God.
These are not common artifacts.
I don't know how it's displayed. How did they display it? That's what I want to know.
The one we have is backed on a card, like a cardboard thing, but I think that was done by a subsequent preservationist. I don't know how they were presented back then. They came with little handbills that would say like, hey, these are great. You should try these. And I think that was meant to be selling it specifically to the postmaster rather than to the customers. It was like, oh, we can sell these in wholesale for this price. And, people will really like them because you can reuse them and you only have to buy them once. That kind of stuff.
Is that why they're called postmasters? Because they were the master of the post?
For any listener that thought this is where we would dive in headfirst to this topic, here we are.
Our regular listeners knew this would happen eventually, I'm sure.
No, that's fair. So, with the discussion of artifacts, what other kind of really cool artifacts do you have? Maybe something you got newer or just something that's just near and dear to your heart?
We got a couple of cool pieces. We have one in particular. It's we have a lot of surgical kits. That's something people come to us with a lot. Is they'll say, "Hey, I've got this whole surgical kit. I'm looking for an institution to house it." We aren't taking those anymore unless they're ID'd to a specific person, because they're actually pretty common. Like if you go on eBay right now and look up Civil War amputation kit, you're going to get a bunch of hits. They are not that uncommon. They are things that are passed down generation by generation. They're much more likely to be preserved. And they were produced at pretty large scale by the 1860s, 1850s, 1860s. But we have one in particular, and it is pretty standard. It's a normal case that's lined with velvet, but it's ID'd to a doctor out of Charlestown, Virginia, today West Virginia. This is where the abolitionist John Brown was tried and hanged for his raid on Harper's Ferry, the thing that kicks off the Civil War.
Oh, wow.
And this doctor is the doctor who examined John Brown during the trial. John Brown had been wounded in the raid. He was laying down for most of the trial. He is effectively a patient. And he made an appeal to suspend the trial so that he could recover. And it was this surgeon who said...
Well, I apologize for interrupting, but in my understanding, so he was like wounded right before the trial, and he's literally convalescing during the trial, is what you're saying?
Yes, there are engravings of John Brown laying in a cot as there's like jury and lawyers and judges and bailiffs all around him. It's pretty wild. And this surgeon is the one who said, yeah, he's well enough. He can go to trial. Never mind, he can't sit up. It's pretty wild stuff. We've got his surgical kit. And it's just such an interesting piece that relates medical history to this really substantial event in the history of America and the history of slavery.
It's super. What kind of stuff's in the kit?
You got your Catlin knife, your Liston knife, scalpels, your capital saw, all the things you'd really expect of a capital amputation kit in this era. Like I said, we got a lot of these. They all kind of blend together after a while. But this one stands out because of who it's related to. And that's true really of all artifacts for museums. The more that you can relate something to a story or to a person, the more valuable it will be to a museum. Not intrinsically necessarily, just a museum gets more use out of something if it has to do with a person. If you just have an old chair, we don't really care. If that chair belonged to Dr. Letterman, then yeah, that's important to us. We're going to make a story out of that.
So you don't want my armchair?
No,
I have an armchair.
Not. How dare you?
Get this out of here. You ever get really mad at somebody and just point at the door? Get out.
Not often.
No.
Most people who come to museums, and this is an interesting thing about museums and something for your audience if they're not museum people, museum audiences are self-selecting. 30% of America actively avoids museums. And 32% of America seeks them out.
Wait,
and the
actively
middle
avoids,
third,
like they're scared of them?
more like they don't feel like museums represent them. This is especially true of lower income and minority people who are in areas that don't have museums that serve them. You're thinking about the way that people imagine museums too. Most people don't imagine museums as history museums are different from art museums. They imagine them all as the same thing. When you see art heists in movies, oftentimes there's historical artifacts that they're working through and like big panels that describe the history and stuff. That's a very different approach, but people kind of imagine them as being the same thing. And museums are often seen as very elitist. And so there's an audience that doesn't seek out museums, that actively avoids them because they feel like they're exploitative. And that's a big thing for us to overcome. And one of the interesting things about medical museums is that medical museums are more accessible. Science museums are often seen as kids' museums, but medical museums are adult museums that you can go into that are more accepting, that are less exclusive. It's a very interesting place to fall into, and I'm sure you'll see some of that in your subsequent interviews with other medical museums, how the things we have to say are getting through in a way that's harder to get through in other forms of entertainment.
Do you guys have any Civil War era dinosaurs at the museum?
I've got some photoshopped images of Civil War dinosaurs. It's a whole thing on the internet, actually. If you look up Civil War dinosaurs, there's a bunch of photoshopped images.
Wait, that's funny.
That's a very true thing, and especially
I didn't know that.
circles.
I don't know why I said that.
There's like soldiers like kneeling over a dead pterodactyl and stuff. It's wild.
Yep, that's one of the most famous ones I'm aware of. So basically, Kyle, you have a lot of work to do if those things are still circulating and popular. Just throwing it out there. But so I interrupted your thought before. So there was a third. You said that avoid and
there's a third that's kind of apathetic. So that you've got a third that actively avoids museums. You've got a third that seeks them out, and you have a third that's kind of like, yeah, I'll go. I mean, I'm not going to like go out of my way to go to a museum, but like if my family's going, I'll go with them. So there's different audiences that we are trying to reach, and use different strategies for doing that. But like I said, medical museums tend to be easier for people to accept. Some of that is the sideshow quality, the idea that like, oh, we can go see gross stuff. And some of that is also that because it's a science museum, it has a tinge of like, this is family friendly. We can get everybody through the door. I will say that's not necessarily true of a place called the Museum of Civil War Medicine. Families don't often come through the door here. They're worried about what their kids are going to see.
Sure. Sure. Is it is it a particularly bloody, grotesque, or otherwise similar experience? I mean, would families families have a good time there? Kids playing with lists and knives and saws and everything?
Oh yeah, no, we hand out the sharp ones to the kids. We have dull kits, but
now
like,
run
that's
around.
No fun. We actually aren't. We're pretty. I wouldn't say sanitized, but we're not gross. Like most people can get through here without feeling queasy. I say most people because there's always going to be somebody. If it has anything to do with medicine, if you even mention certain things, there is an audience that gets queasy.
You don't have a moving diorama, somebody actually sawing the leg off.
I was just thinking that should be as you're leaving.
Oh, dude, that would actually. Because we've been talking about hands-on exhibits here, as we're strategizing about how to revamp the museum, how to update it. And I was thinking that we'd do one with like the weight of a stretcher. Like, could you lift a stretcher in the Civil War? And now I'm wondering, maybe we could like get like a saw handle, and they could like try it out and feel it. Maybe that'd be too much, but I'm brainstorming here with you guys now.
But you could pay extra for that. You could be like, it's $30. You can come saw this leg, blood pours out, like really get into it. The dummies screaming.
We do offer a amputation program that uses foam legs from a surgical education supplier, and we have a reproduction Civil War medical kit that we can use to like do the full amputation.
Whoa,
no blood, but we do the whole thing.
Can you make a promise here on the air that if we come visit the museum in person, that we get to play with that?
I think I could promise that, actually. Yeah, I think that would be a lot of fun.
I will send the contract for that after we record.
I have not checked with my director, but I am absolutely going to say yes right now. And ask forgiveness later.
You can film it. I've already got the Civil War mustache.
Yeah, he does. Yeah.
When we do the blood, we can consult on how it should fall off the table.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
We're going to do this for science. What any other artifacts jump to mind?
We have the only surviving surgeon's tent of the war. It's on display in our galleries, and it may be the only surviving officer's tent of the war. And having it set up there, you get kind of a feeling of like what the day-to-day must have been like. And that is most of the experience. I mean, they're not shooting each other every day here. The Army of the Potomac, which is the main U.S. Army of the Civil War, serves for something like 1,500 days, and only 45 of those are combat. They really are just kind of around and doing
like marching
things.
Around, hanging out.
Yeah, and the surgeons are busy because everybody's getting sick all the time. So getting an idea of like what the everyday experience was like for a medical professional back then, I think it's just kind of cool. There's nowhere else really to get that feeling.
Well, and so many, I think it came up in our ambulance corps, like so many physicians that were, before they went to the Civil War, didn't have a lot of experience with a lot of these things, unless, if I remember correctly, they came from out west and they had experience with gunshots. They had experience with those sort of things. So I can only imagine all the free time is probably put to better use by trying to learn some things. And then occasionally you have your day of combat where now your feet are really held to the fire and you are a surgeon, whether you like it or not at this point, doing things that you only read about. And then a couple of those days go by and, however many days in between battles, I'm sure all that hanging out really formed people a little bit differently.
And that actually ties in with another artifact that I think is pretty cool. Usually I'm not drawn to printed books as artifacts, just because, by nature, they're made in number. They're not individual. But there is one that we have. It's a first edition of a book by Dr. Middleton Goldsmith, examining the uses of bromine in treating hospital gangrene. And it's a really informative book because it's sort of hinting at the germ theory to come.
Sure.
Dr. Middleton Goldsmith is using bromine to treat gangrene, and he's bringing the mortality rate of gangrene down tremendously, from over 40% to 3% in his hospital. But when you read the text, and we have a first edition on display, when you read the text, he's saying things like, okay, I don't really know why this works. I just know it works. So let's keep doing it. He's like using the scientific method to be like, here's my percentages, and here's what it works, and here's what it doesn't. But he still can't say why. He's just like, all I know is that it does, so please do it. And the reason that ties in is that the medical department, the U.S. Army Medical Department, had a library of books that they would distribute to their surgeons. They even had a publishing wing that would use this research. And this is during the war that Middleton Goldsmith is discovering this. They would use that research to then inform the rest of the surgeons, hey, here's what Dr. Goldsmith was doing. You should try it too. And that's what they would use a lot of their downtime for. They do have medical textbooks that are being provided for them.
Do you think it was it similar for the Confederacy too, or is this just Union side?
The Confederacy did have a publishing wing, mostly for manuals of military surgery, that kind of thing, more standard texts. But it's also hard for us to say exactly what they had and didn't have because their medical department burned at the end of the war. So we lost all those records. And that's why when we talk about medical history, we often have to put this asterisk there of like, we don't know as much about the South. Sorry, guys. And also they lost the war. So a lot of the innovations that they came up with weren't inherited by the larger medical community. It was the U.S. medical department that won the war, and they get to pass on their innovations and successes and failures.
Something about history being written by the victors, and that's a saying, right?
Yeah.
Hey, true enough. I mean, the other cool thing that you're alluding to as well is this is pretty contemporary for Joseph Lister, the physician who in England was doing essentially the same kind of antiseptic research, although he was on the cusp of, well, he didn't develop germ theory, but he was a guy who really liked microscopes, liked looking at the microscopic world, and started putting together that these little ditzels that were eventually found to be bacteria in these wounds probably had something to do with all the infection. And he was experimenting with carbolic acid. But I believe it's within this 10-year period of the Civil War and over kind of the 1870s off the top of my head, I think, so when a lot of that was going on with Joseph Lister. And so, yeah, they're like right on the cusp of understanding the earliest signs of infection and how to do surgery cleanly so that people don't just overwhelmingly die of infection. I believe Lister's numbers were similar. They were at least 30s to 40s percent mortality rates that went down to single digits. And then he went on a speaking tour of the U.S. I want to say it's 1880s, somewhere around there.
He was not that long after, because it's 1969 that he publishes his paper.
There you go.
That's like, hey, germ theory is a thing. Here's my antiseptic practices. Please stop killing your patients. And the reaction from U.S. Army veterans, from the surgeons who served in the Civil War, is largely "screw you, Lister."
There's a world reaction too, to be fair.
Yeah, there is definitely that in the European sector as well. And there are some veterans out of the Civil War who say, "Oh yeah, this actually is a good thing. We should do this." But very big figures in Civil War medicine are telling Lister, actually literally to his face in one case, that he has a grasshopper in his head. They're rejecting this very strongly.
It's a bad thing.
Yeah, and a lot of that comes from the Civil War. These guys are, going through really traumatic stuff. One surgeon writes about how his hands were so continuously steeped in blood that they were wrinkled like a washerwoman's. They've been through the ringer. And now some guy from Europe who has not been through what they have comes out and tells them, you're doing it all wrong, you're killing your patients. And they have this visceral reaction and a strong reaction where I think even stronger than a lot of Europe, American medicine rejects Lister very hard until the death of Garfield, President Garfield. We have an article about this on our website, and one of our former employees does lectures about this, how Garfield is the last death of Civil War medicine, the last victim of Civil War medicine, because the doctors are very publicly rejecting germ theory and sticking their fingers in his bullet hole and just completely ignoring everything that Lister has to say. And very clearly killing the president. He absolutely would have survived that. And that is the nail in the coffin. And that's the point in which the American public rises up, and the younger generation of surgeons who by that point, it's been 15, 16 years since the Civil War. There are active surgeons who were not in the Civil War, who don't have the same stake that these guys do. And they're able to say, hey, we need to pump the brakes on this. Like, this is clearly not working. We ought to start doing antiseptic stuff.
Well, I know we've talked about some of these things tangentially in previous episodes, but yeah, what you see in the movies from around that time where, somebody gets shot, then a bunch of different doctors are like digging the bullet out of the screaming patient. They did do those things, but all they did was introduce infection. I mean, generally, if a bullet enters a body, stays there, and the person is overall stable and all right, you tend to leave it there unless that bullet is pressing on something very dangerous to leave alone, etc. And yeah,
no,
right,
Max, you're wrong. It's clear on TV. I've seen this multiple times. You have to get the bullet out, and then everything is fixed.
That's what I don't understand. They must have been looking at textbooks from the Civil War era when they're doing these modern films. It's like, pull the bullet. They still do it. You hear the clink in the metal container.
Yeah. I was going to say, that's the important thing. If it doesn't clink in the container, have you really pulled the bullet?
Yeah.
Mike and Aaron, have you guys done bulletectomies?
0 times. Yeah. No,
they're usually pretty deep.
I've done one. No, I've done one. So the only time you
superficial?
do this, I bring this up just to contrast it. But every once in a while, especially when I was a medical student at in my trauma surgery rotation at a huge trauma center, in the clinic where folks had been a patient once and been shot, what can happen is you get a bullet in, especially like an extremity or kind of in your side. And if it's in the superficial tissues, over time, usually weeks, months, years even, it will start to get pushed towards the skin surface. So some folks would have a bullet like in a muscle or of their arm, say, or their leg, and it wasn't bothering them. But then a couple of years later, as it kind of gets migrated by new tissue growth towards the skin, it becomes irritating and sometimes painful. And so in those cases, you would do a bulletectomy because it's right in the soft tissue. And you numb up the skin, you make a little incision, and you absolutely... I remember pulling the bullet out. I think it was an arm. And I was going to put it into a plastic specimen container, and the surgeon was like, stop. Walked over, got a metal basin. He's like, here.
That's funny.
So he had me clink it into the basin, and I was like, you're right, that was so much better. So generally, you can leave bullets alone.
Yeah, by contrast,
especially because when they hit the skin, they instantly cauterize. They sort of go in, and they got so much heat that generally, if they land there and they're not causing I know they're causing problems, but if they're not causing a like pressing on a spinal cord problem or whatnot, then you'll leave it alone until it might become something you take out later.
It reminds me of an account by a hospital steward in the Civil War who actually did get under fire. Usually they tried to keep their medical professionals, with the exception of stretcher bearers. We talked about that in the other episode. But usually they try to keep their medical professionals off the field. And this hospital steward is there, and he hates it. He thinks this is a terrible idea. We didn't get any good done. And one of the things he says is the bullet will act as a styptic. It'll just hold in there and it'll keep the blood from coming out, and we can deal with it after they get off the field. So he's kind of saying the same thing. Don't worry, leave it in there. Except he's saying, we'll take care of it. We'll pull it later.
I want to say one of the first surgeons to recognize that, you just leave bullets alone was probably John Hunter, at least one of the first that wrote about it. And he was a Scottish surgeon in the Napoleonic Wars who came upon a bunch of soldiers that got left behind on some island, if I remember correctly, and they were all shot. They were all doing fine. Like weeks later, and he said, maybe we should just leave these bullets alone.
Well, in the Civil War, they're doing so many amputations too that like the bullet kind of comes out with everything else. So
well, fair. I mean, so that is that true? Amputations are as prevalent as I feel like a lot of movies and popular media about the subject do seem to indicate. Is that the way it was?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. There's the thing with Civil War medicine is it is both exactly what you imagine and also not what you imagine at all. So they're absolutely doing a ton of amputations. Very conservative number, 60,000 amputations, and probably more than that. But that's actually more than previous conflicts by percentage, more than the Mexican-American War, more than the Revolution, War of 1812, because the bullets they're using, these mini balls, when they strike the body, they crunch up like chewed bubble gum and they careen through the body and splinter bones. Some of these could maybe be saved through a delicate surgery, but they often don't have the time to do that when you're dealing with, 20,000 casualties. They're just running through these operations and they're quickly amputating because that's what it takes. Others, even modern science today, at least as some surgeons tell us, you would have to take it off. It's closer to shrapnel than bullet wounds today. So yeah, they're doing a lot of amputations. We have a whole gallery about that because it is such a prominent part of the public perception and the reality of the Civil War. And in that is another interesting artifact. It's a table. It's a dining room table that was at a house just off the location of the Battle of Cedar Creek. And the table was dragged out of the house onto the lawn so that the surgeons would have light to work with. And it was used as an operating table. That hospital was overrun, captured by the Confederacy, who continued using that table as an operating table. So it's a operating table for both the United States and the Confederacy.
Jeez.
And for a fine meal.
Occasionally, the family, the descendants of this homeowner, will come to the museum and visit it. I held up a camera for them and took photos in front of the table.
Wow.
That's quite a history for that piece of furniture. Well, so with some of the artifacts that we've talked about, I also note that there's some interesting kind of digital exhibits and things like that that the museum has. So I saw like there's soldiers on the go. There's kind of the what they wore section, which allows you to actually click through and like peel back layers off the actual soldier. And I was getting a little apprehensive as far as how detailed this was going to get as I started peeling away layers, but it is very much safe for work. It's okay. Go ahead and check it out. Can you talk a little bit about those exhibits?
Sure. We do have a few interactive exhibits on our website. We also have a very robust social media presence. That's where we do a lot of our most recent examinations of all kinds of topics. If you want to learn about how blood loss was handled, how they constricted blood flow, if you want to hear about individual surgical implements, if you want to hear interesting stories of unexpected faces of Civil War medicine, we have a lot of videos on our YouTube channel, on our TikTok and Instagram, where me especially, I'll be on camera just talking about all these weird little aspects of Civil War medicine, helping to break those down and bring the most interesting stories and the latest research to you.
Especially Civil War CPR, one of my favorites. You basically roll the patient up in all kinds of pretzel shapes. And
that's the knees to the chest.
No, actually, it's so there's two methods back then of resuscitation. They were meant for drowning victims. That's how they were originally designed. But by the Civil War, it's for overdose victims, especially overdose of anesthesia. And there's two methods. There's Hall's Ready method, and I forget the other one.
There's a twisty one. There was like the twist on the side one. Is that the Hall's method or is that the other method?
I think that's Hall's.
Okay.
It's if your listeners want to know, they have to go to our TikTok and look it up. But there's two main methods used. Sylvester's, that's the other one. Okay. There's Hall's Ready method, where you lay the patient on their stomach and then you roll them a quarter to a half turn up, and then you drop them back down on their stomach, and that's supposed to be enough to make them expel air. And then lifting them back up is apparently going to be enough to get air back in. It does not work. The other one is Sylvester's method. Sylvester's method, they lay on their back. You put a blanket or a towel or a pillow or something big under their chest, behind their back, and then you cross their arms and you uncross and recross their arms over and over again. these are both to replace a method where you just stick a bellows in their mouth and use the bellows like in a cartoon, because that was thought to tear the lung by pushing too much air inside. None of these methods really work all that well. Yeah. We have an article I wrote on our website. We have a blog that has a bunch of much more involved stories, and this is one of them. I have one called Civil War CPR, and it's all about the different methods they used. And the craziest thing is that there's only like 3 cases known to have actually resuscitated a patient, and one of them is President Lincoln. President Lincoln, when he was shot at Ford's Theater, he stopped breathing, and they hoisted a surgeon into his box, and the surgeon tried using Sylvester's method, and it didn't work, so he performed mouth-to-mouth. Which at the time was rejected. People were like, mouth-to-mouth doesn't work, don't bother. But he did it, and it brought the president back, at least for a few more hours. So wild story, lots of fun. That's on our website and on our social media channels.
It's funny that they were right about that back in the day, because we don't do that anymore either.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
No, we don't. Yeah, I mean, mouth-to-mouth is it's definitely a no-go nowadays. And interesting, like CPR has done in what we call advanced cardiac life support. So all the things that we do when a heart is stopped and, to try to restart it. So there's a bunch of research, like we can use these drugs like epinephrine and atropine and all these sort of things under all these certain conditions. And if you look at the protocols for what we were taught 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and now, CPR kind of did this arc or advanced cardiac life support, of which CPR is a thing you do. It really went from like all these medications and things like that can be tried in these certain circumstances to, if you push on the chest fast enough and in good rhythm, that's really a big part of the battle. Not saying it's everything you need, but if you at least do that part, you're doing something right. So go learn CPR, everybody. It is actually a very helpful thing.
Yeah, I guess I got to renew. It's been a while for me.
Yeah. Well, they advocate chest only, just the compressions, because partially, I think a lot of people weren't doing it sometimes because they didn't want to do the mouth to mouth. Be like, yeah, don't do that. Just go push on the chest
and not push on the chest because they were blowing in their pie hole.
Right. If you're doing mouth to mouth, you're not doing the CPR. So.
Well, there was one pre-Civil War surgeon from the South who suggested using hypodermic injections of caffeine. Do you think that would help?
Maybe. It could.
I mean, it would.
Depends on how concentrated it is.
Yeah. I mean, it would. No, I don't think it would help. No. Epinephrine, really, we're not sure that it helps. So
epinephrine barely helps.
And my coworker, the director of education here, because we were looking up, hypodermic. We were trying to find advertisements in American newspapers from the 1850s to the 1870s that talk about hypodermic injections, and he found one that referred to injections of whiskey. Just hard Kentucky bourbon.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that does work, though. I mean, that's not ridiculous.
You got to do it in the heart. So that's the key. You just you draw a little red circle, and then you just.
Okay, I saw that Tarantino movie. Yeah,
that's
all
the way.
Injections work better if you put them right in the heart. That bourbon in the vein would annihilate your blood cells. It would just annihilate them. Don't. As we always say, don't take medical advice from the podcast, but
hypodermic is just under the dermis.
Yeah, so that's the problem. You wouldn't circulate, right?
Enough.
Yeah,
it's still probably
there is a role for IV alcohol, though. It's just in a different thing. So it'll be the antidote for certain types of alcohol poisoning.
Yeah, but
they're trying combinations of just about everything in this period. By everything, I mean specifically quinine, alcohol, and opiates. Any of those, mercury too. You put any of those 4 drugs in any combination, and it's a cure for anything.
I mean, it makes something happen. Whether that's beneficial or not, I think, is for time to tell. Wow. I'm going to put one thing in a bookmark for the future, if you don't mind, Kyle. I would love some time to ask you, and maybe even for a full episode, one of your blog posts, or I'm sorry, I don't believe you wrote it, but it was on the website there, was about opium eaters in the Civil War. And I think that is, is a topic that we probably need to cover in one of our standard episodes.
There's a book coming out, I think in the next couple of months, actually. And we're in constant contact with what's his name? I want to say Dan Jones, but I know it's not. He's a historian of the opioid epidemic of the Civil War, and he's got a book coming out, and I think he wrote that actually. We could get you in touch with him.
I won't say no to that. I would love to.
They were addicts at the time were called opium eaters, and they would just swallow pills. That's not the only way that opiates are taken. They're taken every way. Powder that would just be like sprinkled onto a wound, injections, laudanum where it's suspended in alcohol. If there's some way that you can take it through the eyes, they'll do it.
We have definitely tangentially covered some of those subjects.
Yep, fun fact, you can also take vodka through the eye. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. We're not saying you should. I mean,
Don't
Aaron might
do
be,
it.
but
no, don't.
I think as an entity, we are not saying that.
If you like your eyeballs, don't give them vodka.
So one question I had to ask, Kyle, is that, you've been with the museum, as you said, many years now. And I'm just kind of curious, is there something that experience has made you kind of look at the Civil War or the medical history of the Civil War completely differently than you thought it was going to be? Something that kind of changed your perspective on sort of the popular way we view some of these subjects? Just something that really opened your eyes. Anything jump to mind?
I think it's I guess I'm not really surprised by it when I think about it, but it wasn't something I thought about coming in, is just how connected the Civil War is to the rest of the world in medical history and otherwise, that this conflict doesn't exist in a vacuum. And that sounds, again, obvious when you say it out loud, but getting into the medical history here, seeing how it has an effect on the spread of general anesthesia, on the world's acceptance of systematized medical evacuation, the rejection of germ theory in America as it comes over from Europe, just the ways that this is connected to a much, much larger world is a testament also to the scale of the Civil War, that it's such a huge, gargantuan conflict. There are people killing each other in California over this. There's raids across the Canadian border. The Confederates invade Mexico at one point. I mean, it's bonkers. There's a Civil War ship is sunk off the coast of France. There's Australians getting recruited. It's wild. And this scale is devastating, but it also makes inescapable how much this is connected to the world at large. And that translates through the medical history.
Interesting.
I didn't really think about it as a global conflict. And I wonder, we just kind of,
me neither.
It gets glossed over in school. You're like, there's a North, they're the good guys, there's a South, they're the bad guys. The war lasts this long. Lincoln was shot.
It depends on which books you get given, I think.
Well, that's true. Yeah. That was not how I was taught.
No.
I got my schooling
It's a
in
war
Southern
for
California.
states' rights against
No, but it
the
was-
invaders
yeah.
from the North. Right?
Yeah. But I'm just saying,
states'
it's
rights
like,
to do
it's
what?
glossed. The same with the Revolutionary War. It's just glossed over. It's, Paul Revere.
Well, I try not to fault schools too much for that because the conflict is so big.
Yeah.
Like one of the things I see on our social media all the time is like, I never learned this in school. And it's like, yeah, because he's some random private from Kentucky. Like, why would you?
Yeah.
It's so big. It's impossible to capture all these things.
Yeah. Good point.
We're never going to stop researching this because it's just too much. So I try not to blame schools too much for that, but allowing for nuance. And that's where we can fit in. That's the reason we exist, is to be able to say, hey, here are some things that you would not have learned in school. And we're here to help you learn that.
And it takes 3 museums spread across different territories here to try to even encompass all that. So to your point,
I think that's so cool.
Yeah, I've got one that I'm working on right now. It's the Journal of a Civil War surgeon who was in Japan during the Civil War. They were chasing a Confederate raider in the Pacific, and as they're sailing around there, the American consul in Japan is like, "Hey, some stuff's going down. We need protection," and they order the ship to remain on station. So for like 6 months, this doctor is just like meeting the shogunate's representatives and like getting involved in the Bakumatsu period, and like they end up fighting the Choshu domain. I mean, it's pretty wild stuff. And it's all derived from the Civil War. They were chasing rebels and they just wound up here. It's pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, why did they not cover that in 7th grade? I feel cheated.
This is so dumb.
Would have been Samurai Civil War. That would have
They
been.
did cover it in the movie Last Samurai, so there's that.
They did cover it?
Tom Cruise is stepping up.
That's
to,
right.
Which is very, very loosely based on that period, on the Bakumatsu. I hope I'm pronouncing that right, where the shogun begins to fall, and just the weird tensions that are going on there. But yeah, there were Americans there, absolutely, and some of them did actually end up fighting against the Japanese.
Wow.
All right. It's foreshadowing. So with that, we would like to. Well, it's true.
Took me a minute. Yeah, got it.
Yep. It's a slow burn. With that, in closing here, Kyle, so I want to ask a question and see. It's not that I'm trying to outsource our own creative process here. I promise you, we do that up front when we have you on the episode. But is there a possible subject or something you would like to see our show cover?
Well, the things that I'll tell you what we're trying to get into here, which is number one, a better understanding of general anesthesia in the period. What does it look like? How is it being popularized? Because it is almost every surgery of the Civil War has anesthesia. I know I mentioned that on the last episode, but that's a big deal for us. The role of William T.G. Morton, the guy who popularizes anesthesia, the one who really brings it into the public sphere, and also some of the darker stuff in the background of that, because he isn't the first one to use general anesthesia in America. That's Crawford W. Long, who's in, I think, Georgia at the time. And he's using human experimentation to do that. He's performing unnecessary metacarpal amputations on enslaved children. Pretty dark stuff. And that, unfortunately, hey, we're the Museum of Civil War Medicine. We're going to be a bummer. That kind of stuff pops up. Another one for us is the birth of the American eugenics movement in the medical establishment. Several of the surgeons in the Confederate Army are proto-eugenicists, that before the war, they were known for beginning these ideas of quasi-medical race and how that would affect their practice. And some of these Confederate generals or surgeons become prominent members of the eugenics movement, especially Hunter Holmes McGuire, Thomas Jackson's personal surgeon, Stonewall Jackson's personal surgeon, becomes president of the American Medical Association. And as that is publishing a paper with another fella talking about eugenics and what that means. And that we haven't explored that fully, but I think that's an important part of medical history that is now gaining traction in pop med history too. There are numerous good books on this. And it's something that I'd love to dig into a little more.
Well, I always appreciate subjects that are really easy to write humorous jokes about. I don't. Important to cover, though, so I'm willing to try. And I think at least anesthesia, we can see where that one goes. I think that would be a nice maybe future segment, and we can certainly talk about having you back for it. And I think that's about all the time we should take of yours today. Is there anything else you'd like to let our listener know about the museum, upcoming events, or anything else, a way that they can get involved and come see you?
Yeah, sure. Best thing you can do to keep up with us is to follow us on our various social media platforms. We are on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, and we update all of those continuously. So check those out. Visit our website, civilwarmed.org. And best of all, come visit us. Come see one of our 3 museums. You can come to the main location here in Frederick Thursday through Sunday without an appointment. We're open from 10 to 5, 11 to 5 on Sunday. And all other locations and all other days, you can send in a request for a reservation. Reservations cost nothing more than the usual ticket would have. And we'll open up the museum for you. You can come explore it. We like to work with your schedule. So check our website, come and visit us, and follow us on social media.
And we will obviously absolutely be linking all that stuff. And we do follow you guys. We'll continue to do so and being a pain in the neck as much as we can. But we would definitely like to drive some more folks to you. And I will put it on my to-do list again that we want to come see this museum in person and hang out with you.
For sure. Yeah, we'd love to have you.
That sounds good. And then we get to play with the amputation kit that was promised. Right. I'm just calling back to it.
That's right.
Yes, I'll let my director down easy on that one.
Feel like they're bringing their own blood. They're bringing their own blood. Don't worry about it.
That's okay. All right. It's fine.
Always have a fresh supply. All right, Kyle, really appreciate everything.
Great. Good to see you guys.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Kyle.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, man.
We want to give our thanks once again to Kyle Dalton for taking time out of his busy schedule to do this interview. In the meantime, let us know what you thought. Our website and link tree is located in the show notes. All the links to our social media are there. We do read your messages and emails, so do send them on in. And if we got something wrong, let us know that too. We'd also appreciate a few moments of your time if you could give us a 5-star rating and or a kind comment, especially on places like Apple iTunes. Let us know that you enjoy the show. Let others know. And this is a free way for you to make an impact and to bring the show to others. The other thing you can do to support the show is to take a few moments and post about us on your social media. Those little bits really add up for us, and we always appreciate when people do them, as you, if you are a listener for a while, may know. As always, our merchandise is also available via our website. All that's left now is the outtakes and sign off. So with that, I'm Dr. Max from the Poor Historians Podcast, signing off, AMA.
Wait, you guys don't have a Patreon?
Mm-mm.
Not as of yet.
You're a podcast. I thought it's like legally required that all podcasts have a Patreon.
Fair.
I still can't believe somebody paid $2,000 for it.
That's amazing. I just think it's funny. It's the postmaster. Like, if it stamps, condoms. I mean, it's
like it's both. You can lick it stick. Cut that.
Oh, the fun idea behind this too, Kyle, was that there should be less editing on my part, since it would just be a nice smooth conversation going forward.
That's why he didn't tell us about it until today.
That's not
no
true.
problem if you're not available.